Hello. Well, as Justin said, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have an office out in Wheat Ridge, and I'm usually in my office helping people overcome anxiety disorders and relationship problems. So why on earth would I be here tonight talking about authoritarianism? It seems like everything that happens in my professional life started with this silly little blog that I keep. I've had it for about 10 years, and when I started it, I answered quirky little questions about psychology, and one of my first posts was debunking this myth that we only use 10% of our brain. And this is a myth that's been debunked many times by people smarter than me, but it researches every once in a while, and I think I understand the appeal of it, that 10% myth. It's really about the untapped potential and what we could accomplish if we somehow managed to access that other 73%. But that was a joke. I was a psychologists are not good at that. But it was not well delivered, so I apologize for that.
No, it was good. It was good.
Okay.
Maybe we can do the psychology of a bomb.
The psychology of what?
That was
Psychology of that.
Another bad one.
So occasionally I take my blog in social directions and political directions, and recently I wrote a pretty long piece about authoritarians on campus. These are the little busybodies that run around telling people what they're allowed to say and what they're allowed to think, and they're kind of obnoxious and they're very pushy, and they'll call you racist and a sexist and all kinds of things if you don't agree with them. And these authoritarians do not confine themselves to campus. They find their way into every area of our life, every interaction that we try to enter into. You know how it is. I mean, imagine that you have a woman who has a hot dog stand, and she's looking for somebody to help her run this hot dog stand. She needs an assistant. And down the street there's a high school kid who's looking for his first job. And so these two people, they meet each other and they enter into this wonderful, mutually beneficial relationship. Two people that are different ages, different genders, maybe they're even from different countries, but the beauty of the free market and the freedom of the respect of the individual is that these two people can enter into this mutually beneficial relationship, and it's beautiful. And then along comes Hillary, who says, no, I won't allow this relationship on these $5 an hour terms because this person is exploiting that person. Or maybe along comes Trump and says, no, that person is exploiting this person, so I won't allow this relationship on these terms. I'm here to save the day. Now, nobody invited these people to this interaction. Nobody invited Hillary or Trump to come in and help them work out this arrangement. Not the hot dog lady, not the high school kid. These authoritarians just invite themselves. And why did they do it? Well, who cares? Because we're never going to persuade Hillary or Trump or any other self-appointed authoritarian to respect the individual. We're never going to persuade them of the beauty and the sanctity of the free markets and the individual spirit. But what about, we're also not going to, I should add, we're not going to persuade that relatively small percentage of people who hover around them and try to elevate them to power. Those people are lost causes. We can't convince them to agree with us about individuality. But what about that great big persuadable middle? The people who probably don't want to be controlled, and they probably don't have much of a desire to control somebody else, but they end up voting for policies and people that are authoritarian in nature. And I think my colleagues are a great example of this. Let me talk about psychologists for a minute, because I know a lot about psychologists, and they're an interesting crowd. They're a wonderful crowd. They have big hearts. They're very caring. And for the most part, they're pretty intelligent. They do, for some reason, they do remarkably well on IQ tests. Maybe because they wrote the test. But they're good people, but they have this very strange relationship to authoritarianism. If you ask your average psychologist, should one person be allowed to dominate another individual, to control what they can own, what they can say, how much money they can make, the psychologist is going to say to you, no, that's morally repugnant. And it's also unhealthy. What is it? What's going on with the person who wants to dominate somebody else? And what's going on with the person who wants to be dominated? Those two people will never reach their potential until they learn how to run their own lives. That's what a psychologist might tell you. And if you put that question in the context of gender, should a man be allowed to control what a woman can say, what she can own, how much money she can make, then the answer becomes, hell no. What's wrong with you? Why would you even ask such a question? That's morally repugnant. But if you ask that same psychologist, should one person, in the form of an elected official, be allowed to dominate millions of people? What they can say, what they can own, how much money they can make? Then the answer from psychologists becomes a resounding yes. Especially if I agree with that person, then definitely yes. So what's going on? How do people have room in their heads for these two different moral foundations, where on the one hand they can be very opposed to authoritarianism and control and coercion, but on the other hand they endorse it? And how do I know this to be true? Well, I know this to be true because there is a research psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, and he administered a survey to a lot of my colleagues not too long ago. And on this survey, he asked specific policy questions. And on those questions, I should point out that all of the psychologists almost answered in unison to the tune of 96%. They were in agreement. Okay, and this is a very unusual thing. You don't usually find 96% when you're studying a population's behavior unless you're asking silly questions like, are accountants good at math? Well, yes, almost all of them are good at math. Other than that, you don't find this kind of uniformity in a population. But he found it among psychologists. And some of the questions he asked, they answered in an authoritarian sort of way. He asked, should the government control guns? And my colleagues, 96% of them said, yes, government should control guns. Should the government control healthcare? And 96% of them said yes. Very libertarian, or very authoritarian. But then he asked them questions that they answered in more of a libertarian way. Should marijuana be legal? And they said yes, but 96%. Should gay marriage be legal? Yes. So what's going on? What I see in this is that my colleagues have sort of either a confused or an ambivalent mindset about authoritarianism. But you know, it doesn't really matter how confused or ambivalent they are, because when they go to the voting booth, they all do the same thing. 95% of my colleagues in the last presidential election voted for the major party candidate who promised the most government interference in their lives. Now, both major party candidates offered a lot of governmental interference, but they voted for the one who answered the most by 95%. So what this tells me about my colleagues is two things, and I think it's not just my colleagues. I think it's a lot of people, that big persuadable middle, who don't give a whole lot of thought to authoritarianism because they don't feel threatened by it. I think it says on one hand that psychologists are operating from a moral foundation that says we need to reduce suffering. Because that's one of the things that really drives psychologists, is reduction of suffering. So if you show them somebody who's suffering with anxiety or insomnia or schizophrenia or whatever it may be, that psychologist is going to be powerfully compelled to reduce that suffering. And on the other hand, if you show them suffering on a societal level, then that's a much bigger problem. And they're even more compelled to reduce that suffering. I'll give you an example. You remember a few years ago when our dear leaders were relieving us of the burden of incandescent light bulbs. We're supposed to eliminate our light bulbs.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, the world is a better place. We were supposed to replace them with those curly Q, mercury-filled compact fluorescents, because that was what was available at the time. Now we have better options. No thanks to the government, thanks to the free market. But at the time, that's what we had left. And I am not sure of this because I haven't conducted a poll, but I would bet, knowing my colleagues the way I do, that they overwhelmingly supported eliminating incandescent bulbs from our lives because they probably saw suffering on a grand scale. Somebody showed them a photo of a skinny polar bear or something and their heartstrings got going and they said, we have to rid the earth of this scourge. I'm betting that that's what happened. Because they're motivated to reduce suffering. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they like Stalin or any other kind of dictator. It's because they want to reduce suffering. Now that, I think, leads into the second thing I notice about my colleagues, which is a special kind of logical fallacy or logical error, which is that when they start thinking about reducing suffering on a big scale, they lose sight of the individual. Now, it's not that these people don't care about the individual, they love the individual. They want to help the individual, but they lose sight. So, for example, when they're ready to eliminate incandescent light bulbs, they forget about the farmer who has to go out to a cold barn at 4 in the morning and turn on this light bulb that's going to take 5 minutes to warm up. And they supported a policy in my little hypothetical situation that is something, they're doing something on a societal level that they would never do to an individual. They would never walk up to an individual and say, you cannot be trusted to choose your own light bulb. I'm going to protect you from yourself. Psychologists would never do that. But their moral foundation compels them to take on an authoritarian stance. So what do we do about this? How do we reach that persuadable middle? You know, the kind of people who probably don't want to control others, don't want to be controlled, and they don't see what happens when one person starts controlling another. They haven't really thought ahead when they say, yeah, getting rid of light bulbs is a good idea, incandescent light bulbs, good idea. They don't really see that they're taking the freedom away from another person, but they're not doing it personally. They're having somebody else do it for them. And they don't see that that person is doing it for them has a lot of people behind them holding a lot of guns and money. And they don't see that those people with guns and money might point them at me someday and take away a freedom that I cherish. They're not thinking ahead, and it's not because they're stupid. Believe me, it's not because they're stupid. It's because they're thinking with their heart and their morality, and the heart doesn't think ahead. And there's lots of precedent to say that people who take power really can't be trusted to rein themselves in. But the heart doesn't know that. The heart only knows there's some pain and I have to eliminate. So how do we reach these people? Well, I can tell you how not to reach them. See, and then let me tell you something about us libertarians. We're devastating debaters. Some people have called us master debaters. And because we study economics.
Someone's got to get off.
We study economics, we study history, we study logic. And so when we come to an argument, we come loaded for bear. And the unfortunate part of that is that we lose a lot of arguments because we start out with history and logic and economics. And what do we know about people? We know that when you argue rationally, when two people debate rationally using logic, what happens? Well, they both go away convinced that they're right and the other person is wrong, more so than when they started. And this is a well-studied phenomenon that when you hit somebody with a logical argument, you compel them to counter with their own logical argument. And so this is like compelling them to practice a song on the piano. The more times they do it, the better they get, and the more they are in love with that viewpoint or that song or whatever it is that they're practicing. So starting out with the logical argument tends to backfire when you're trying to convince people, and especially when you're trying to convince them that what they're doing is actually kind of harmful. When they hire somebody or elect somebody to point a gun at somebody else and dictate the nature of their business relationships or take away their incandescent bulbs, that's kind of a nasty thing to do. People don't want to hear that they're doing nasty things because they don't think of themselves as doing nasty things and they don't intend to do nasty things. So what if we approach it a little bit differently when we're trying to convince people of the sanctity of the individual? Remember Jonathan Haidt. He was the man, the psychologist, who administered this survey. And Jonathan Haidt is a fascinating guy because he's unusually open-minded. He has built his career on studying morality. He's been doing that for about 30 years, studying morality. And he noticed this 95-96% agreement among his colleagues, this tremendous lack of diversity, ideological diversity among his colleagues, and he regarded it as a problem even though he agreed with them. These people are overwhelmingly progressive on campus, which is fine, but or it's not fine, I don't know if it's fine. I think ideological diversity would be good. But in any event, he noticed it as a problem. And he said that we could be better psychologists, better social scientists if we had some ideological diversity here. So he took this lens of morality that he'd been doing for 30 years and he applied it to people's political choices. What is the morality behind the decisions that people make when they're voting for policies and people? And an interesting thing happened. Even though he regarded himself, and he will admit this, again, he's unusually open-minded and honest, he will admit that he once regarded himself as a progressive. As libertarians, maybe you'd agree with me that where we find the most authoritarianism is on the far left and the far right, on the extremes. This is where people want to boss other people around. And so he was over there on the far left, on the extreme, big government kind of guy. But as he started studying the morality of the people that he disagreed with, he changed, and he changed pretty rapidly. He now regards himself as a centrist, and I don't know what that means on a particular policy level, but I know enough about his ideology to know that he's no longer a big authoritarian government-controlled kind of guy. So what happened? Did he fall in love with the logic of conservatives and libertarians? Probably not, because that's not what he was studying. What he was studying was moral foundations. And maybe that's what he fell in love with. Now, I've never met Jonathan Haidt, but I have this theory that the reason he changed so dramatically and became so much more open-minded is that, contrary to what his progressive friends had been telling him for all these years, conservatives and libertarians are not bad people, that they operate from a moral foundation just like he does. And I think it was that exploration of the moral foundation that opened his heart to the logical arguments that were contrary to what he had believed all of his life. So how can we use this? Well, when we're, as libertarians, arguing loaded for bear, we can lose the argument by starting out very intensely. Let's go back to the hot dog stand. And let's say that as a libertarian, I want to advance the argument that there should be no minimum wage because government has no business interfering in the decision that these two individuals have made. It's not their business. Now, I can come up with all kinds of evidence showing the unintended consequences of that sort of economic management, or I could even come out with a really aggressive logical argument. I could say to this coworker or this family member, whoever it is that I'm arguing with, well, if $15 an hour is a good minimum wage, what about 50? Why not 100? Why not $1,000 an hour? We could all work for minimum wage and we could be rich beyond our wildest dreams. And that's kind of a devastating argument. It's kind of hard to argue with because it points out the ridiculousness of advancing $15 or $16 or some arbitrary number. But whoever I'm arguing with is going to walk away thinking they're right and I'm kind of an aggressive jerk. What if instead I find a moral commonality between us? That, hey, you and I clearly want the same thing. We both want the hot dog lady to have her business. We don't want to force her out of business. And we both want the high school kid to have the option of a job. Neither one of us is trying to destroy those options. I'm going to see where you got to where you got to, because we both have these similar desires. And isn't it interesting, we have these similar moral desires, but isn't it interesting that we arrived at different places? And what that does, what that kind of opening does, is it opens their heart, because we start with the brain before we get the heart open. And we need to get the heart open first. And starting with that kind of argument tends to open the heart a little bit, because if you use a line like, I see where you're coming from morally, it plays on one of the most basic foundations of human behavior, which is that we reciprocate. You can see it all day, every day, how human beings play this social ping pong with each other. You say hello, they say hello. You say nice weather, they say nice weather. You say, I see where you're coming from, and they're probably going to say, I see where you're coming from. And if you can open that door a little bit, then maybe you can plant a seed. You don't need to hit them with everything you got, but maybe you can plant a seed that these two people, this store owner and this high school kid, man, maybe they should just be left to work things out for themselves. And plant the seed and walk away. And if the person doesn't reciprocate, if you say, I see where you're coming from, and they say, damn straight, you probably weren't going to convert them anyway, so move on to somebody else.
Right.
So that's really all I have to say about that. How did it